collegefootballnerds.com. A little different from what y'all are used to who've been watching this channel. I had a bit of a rebrand last week. We talked about it some in our crazy opening echoey segment on our live show. By the way, we did do a 2-hour live show. So if y'all want to have something, to listen to over the holidays, because these videos are going to kind of trickle out, that'd be a good one for you to listen to. We're going to do Alabama, Oklahoma today. We're also going to do Clemson and Notre Dame, and we're going to touch on Georgia and Texas. I want to remind everybody, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. We talk about college football here, and it is from a data analytics standpoint. We do get into some gut and some opinion, but we run a computer model. And at the end, we give our picks, but we go through a pretty detailed discussion. It's not a quick hot take kind of show. For those of you Oklahoma fans that are new to our channel, know that we're pretty objective. So we're not going to be bashing the Big 12 or bashing your team. We're actually pretty high on your team, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But do know you're more than welcome to disagree with us. Just do it in the comments, back it up with data, and we will engage you there. All right, Josh, Oklahoma, Alabama, kicking it out of the gate for the playoffs. A couple of real quick questions, and then I got a lead for you. So, okay, quick question number one. Is this the game, if America, the college football watching America could draw up, is this the game that they would want in the opening round if they could put two teams together?
I think it is. I think this is a juxtaposition of two teams. One's offensive driven, one's known to their defense, and a lot of people are going to be interested in it for that reason.
Is this the game, if you were going to draw it up personally, the most fun, most interesting matchup that you would have kind of put on the card?
I think it's one of the more interesting ones because I think Oklahoma has the potential to score to keep up with Alabama. I kind of personally wanted to see Ohio State play Alabama just from a sheer talent perspective, and I think it would have been but, outside that, I think probably is maybe the most interesting matchup in my opinion.
All right. So, and I think for me, I wanted this matchup. I wanted Alabama, Oklahoma. I'm more in that first group that you said in terms of the clash of styles. And there is I don't think you could have drawn it up any better. That what happened in the Heisman ceremony, we're not going to talk about the just hammering of Tua's name from whoever that was. They had announced the Heisman. Anyway, the drama with the Heisman coming in with these two teams playing each other, it couldn't be more perfect. We said last year, going into the playoffs, that if Alabama drew Oklahoma, that would have potentially been the toughest draw for them in the opening round of the playoffs. I want you to go a little bit on basically what we've been saying all year about Clemson, and to give Oklahoma fans a backdrop on that. We've been saying we don't know what we know about Clemson because the ACC is so bad this year, and it is objectively bad. All the metrics say that they're closer to the AAC than they are the SEC. But Clemson, regardless of schedule, can still be elite. I would argue, and I think you would as well, that's why I'm teeing this up for you, I would argue that, Oklahoma fans, I see them talking on Twitter all the time. They're rolling their eyes about what people say about Big 12 defenses and sort of trying to say, well, our offense is elite, and you're trying to throw at the feet of the Big 12 defense. Is it a case where both sides are right? That people saying Big 12 defenses are trash are right, but Oklahoma fans who are saying, you're saying it's defenses, we're saying it's offenses, and their comments about their offense are actually right as well?
It's easy to say that the Big 12 has terrible defenses, right? But statistically, while they do give up a ton of yards, it's also the same reason why the offenses are great. And if you're in a conference where you're playing, especially in a conference where you play a 9-game conference schedule, 9 of 12 games are against yourselves, by mathematical, law, if a team has a really good offense, they have made the teams that play them look like they have a really bad defense. You cannot have great statistical offensive numbers without requiring the conference to have really bad statistical defensive numbers. So I think you kind of have to understand that the give and take is required, that if the offenses are that good, the defenses are going to have to look that bad. And the flip side to it, if the defenses are that bad, by necessity, all the offenses do have to look that good statistically. I think where you have to draw the line here is in understanding how Oklahoma fits into the grand scheme of things relative to the rest of their conference in the Big 12. And I think, one, having watched the Big 12, quite a bit this year, we did some videos, a number of different videos for Big 12 games. We've watched a lot of Big 12 games with a lot of teams. I try to follow college football in general. There's a lot of sloppy play, frankly. I think there's a lot of missed tackles. There's a lot of missed assignments, a lot of blown coverages. Some of it is due to the explosiveness of the offenses, how much the defenses are on the field. I think a lot of it, though, is stylistic. One of the big things that stands out to me in the Big 12, frankly, is I don't think the linebacker play is great. A lot of times watching games, there's a lot of teams in the Big 12 that really just don't have very good linebacker play right now across the conference. That creates problems both against the run and the pass. Everything in football defensively really starts with the middle linebacker position and moves out. And people talk about the defensive front. Obviously, if you're completely deficient in any position, it's bad. And if you're terrible at the D line, then the guys behind them can't make up for it. So you have to be competent pretty much from the front on. But you're never going to be good if the defensive line isn't in itself good. But sort of getting back to the original point, looking at the conference as a whole, Oklahoma 11.6 yards per attempt. Okay, so the average team in the conference was Texas Tech. That's 7.9 yards per attempt. That's not an unusual number. That's not a terribly high number. And everybody below them, Texas, Baylor, TCU, Kansas State, Kansas, they're all below 8 yards per attempt. It's not like everybody in the Big 12 was putting up these kinds of ridiculous numbers. So if they're not putting up ridiculous numbers and Oklahoma is, at some point you have to say, it has to be something to do with the fact that Oklahoma's doing something right. And being this is an SEC matchup, I'll make another point. The average SEC team this year was Florida. Florida was at 7.7 yards per attempt. Right above them was Tennessee at 7.9. The average Big 12 team and the average SEC team had about the same yard per play average, like median team when I take the average. The trick is the top of the Big 12, Oklahoma and West Virginia, were so good that they basically made everybody else worse. The point I was making earlier, their statistics are so good. They're the 11-1 and 10-2 team. Everybody else's defensive statistics look bad because for Oklahoma and West Virginia to be very good and to have those numbers, they had to do it at the expense of everyone else. And in a smaller conference, that things get spread out a little bit less. Alabama ran numbers up almost just as badly within the SEC, but they don't play everyone in the SEC. And a lot of teams that play them play other people, so the numbers kind of get averaged out more across the conference. So I do think Oklahoma is that good. I think the fact that their numbers are that much out of whack from the rest of the Big 12 shows how good they are. But I will also say, objectively, having watched them, I do think throughout the Big 12, defenses haven't always been up to par, and there's too many clear mistakes for me to think that they're necessarily all that either. But the big trick is, again, everything's taken in isolation. Whatever the conference does positive offensively has to be a negative defensively or vice versa. And then you have to figure out where that baseline is. If you're doing that give and take, where did it start from? Conferences and football in isolation, because it's so relational, doesn't really help you when you have matchups between two different conferences with very little overlap.
I also think Oklahoma's offense is legit. And I think, and I told somebody, I said this on the live show, I said, Alabama fans, do a little homework. Go watch Oklahoma play West Virginia. Ignore Oklahoma's defense and just watch their offense. And, I think fans, when they go back and watch other teams play when they're about to play them, there's a little confirmation bias there. So they'll go watch their worst game to make them feel better about themselves. Like, oh, yeah, we can beat them because we saw them only put up 21 against Army. Army was weird. Throw Army out. Even in their loss against Texas, they put up 45. Go watch them play a couple of these games. And notice that not just Kyler Murray, but Lincoln Riley's offense in general is, I said on the show, a work of art. It is. It's beautiful to watch. If you're a college football fan, you'll love it. I would argue, though, that I disagree with you a little bit on the defenses being a side effect of the offenses being so good. And I'll tell you why. I say back it up with the numbers. I'm backing it up with numbers. Iowa State out of conference. I want to look at how the Big 12 performed out of conference. Iowa State scored 3 on Iowa. Kansas State scored 10 on Mississippi State. Texas Tech, with their starting quarterback, scored 27 on Ole Miss. They got bombed by Ole Miss, 47-27. Baylor put up 27 on Duke, which is a pretty bad defense, but gave up 40. Texas Tech, again, we said 27. TCU 28 on Ohio State, where other teams like Maryland that were built the same way were scoring 50 plus. West Virginia scored 40 on Tennessee. Tennessee gave up 50 multiple times in the SEC to some decent but not amazing offenses. So it looks like when they venture outside the four walls of their conference, they're not scoring as many points and they're giving up more points. Now, turn this around. That's one side of it. The other side of it is Oklahoma's defense as bad as their 130 out of 130 pass defense and like 98 out of 130 overall scoring defense? Or is their defense a side effect of what we've seen with other Big 12 offenses?
Well, I'll leave part of this discussion for later when we talk about the model, because we do get into opponent averages, and I think it colors it a little bit. But just in general, I do think the defense struggles. I think they objectively struggle. I think they have some strengths and they have some weaknesses, maybe more than.
Are you being kind here because we have a new Oklahoma audience? Because I've heard you talk about the Oklahoma defense this year, and it wasn't, I think they struggle a little bit.
This is more of an introspection that I came, having watched a lot of games, everything I can of their defense. It wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was, but that's a pretty low bar. To your point, you noted West Virginia, right? I'm going to step back and piggyback off that point before going to Oklahoma, because I think it helps color this discussion. West Virginia gave up 40 points to Tennessee, Tennessee gave up 40 points to West Virginia. West Virginia scored 40. But the problem with that statement is, to your point, Tennessee gave up 47 to Florida, who a lot of people don't think is a very good offense. They gave up 58 to Alabama. They gave up 50 to Missouri. It wasn't really unusual for them. 38 to Georgia. I mean, it wasn't unusual for them to give up 40 points in a game this year. They did it in almost half their games. So first, I kind of have to view it from the lens that, like, to your point, I don't know that Big 12 offenses are so unstoppable in general, and not even talking about Oklahoma here, that it excuses everything. But what you see from Oklahoma, and we have the advantage of having a lot of advanced stats now. It takes several days for all this stuff to run. We don't usually get to talk about it in our previews, but I can now. S&P Plus is not foolproof. It's not something, obviously, SB Nation generates it. Bill Connolly manages it. It's an interesting system because it gives you some decent numbers that are very much adjusted for opponent quality and whatnot. Passing marginal efficiency, they're 126 out of 130 teams. That's objectively atrocious. So if you want to move the ball with a short passing game on Oklahoma and you have consistency and accuracy, you'll do it. Oklahoma does not generate a pass rush at times at all. I think both of us went back and watched the Iowa State game, and I think the observation both of us had in that game is they got really no pressure at any point in that game.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I want to interject. I watched the Texas Tech game for a third time this week and noted I only wanted to watch their pressure on the quarterback. And I know Big 12 is a little different. They do a lot of 3-3-5 type defense, drop 8 a lot. They did not, even when they sent 4 a lot in the first half. They did not get a single QB hurry at all. At one point, they rolled the pocket one time and the quarterback had a little bit of a hurry, but they didn't earn a legit 3 or 4 man rush QB hurry in the entire first half against Texas Tech.
Right, and my point with Iowa State, because I need to qualify this statement and I forgot to earlier, they got some pressures and hurries in that game, but everything I saw from that perspective came from a called blitz that wasn't picked up properly by the offensive line. And I understand that's a little bit of the game of football, but they weren't necessarily overloads. Their pressure comes from basically relying on the offense not even attempting to block you, because Oklahoma does not get pressure when they're blocked properly at all. And that's why the efficiency ratings are so low. Sacker rate is 93rd in the country. And again, there's only, I forget the number now, about 65 Power 5 teams. Oklahoma's defense, in terms of The ability, basically everything that has to deal with the ability to rush the passer, stuff rate 99th in the country, sack rate 93rd, marginal passing efficiency 126th. Anything that deals with disruption, really terrible metrics. They're a low-level group of 5 team and all these metrics and advanced stats. And that's not me trying to bash. That's just me telling you, again, pulling from S&P because it's a third-party objective metric. I'm trying, like we do a lot on this channel, we use numbers to make our point so that we're not just blowing hot air, but we have some substance to it. And you can disagree with us and disagree with the conclusion, but we have a rational basis for thinking this. Where they have been more successful than I thought, I will say, is their run defense has been better than I thought. I also think they are decent at not getting destroyed by the deep pass, and that sort of holds up now when I'm looking at S&P. So I made my observations, and I'm using S&P to validate them. Marginal explosiveness in the passing game, 65th. That's still really bad. It's not atrocious the way the efficiency metrics are. So they give up a lot of deep plays, but they do occasionally break them up. But again, rushing marginal explosiveness, 38th, that's actually somewhat decent. Marginal efficiency in running game, 61st, that's really bad, but it's not horrific. And that's why they're rushing S&P metrics 53rd, but the passing is an atrocious 91st.
But real quick on all of these numbers to give them context, what does Alabama's offense do to teams who are atrocious in some areas defensively and not atrocious in other areas of defense? Maybe give some perspective to Oklahoma fans that aren't familiar with Alabama. In terms of defensive ranking, what are some of the teams that Alabama played this year that had similar defenses, and how do they fare against them?
Right. So I think that's probably a fair thing to sort of dig into. Oklahoma is very familiar with how good their offense is. I think that one of the first things you have to do as an Oklahoma fan, if you want to approach this game honestly, is appreciate how good Alabama has been offensively themselves. One team that is kind of similar to Oklahoma defensively, probably the closest team, is Tennessee. Oklahoma finished 89th in S&P. Tennessee was 96th. Tennessee had some sort of similar issues. They were decent against the explosive plays, 35th nationally. Oklahoma's 49th. But in terms of success rate, basically how efficient you allow an offense to be, Tennessee's 116th, Oklahoma's 109th. Very similar statistical profiles. Alabama put up 58 points against Tennessee and could have scored 70 plus.
Yeah, they shut it down in the third quarter.
Yeah, they middle of the third quarter with, and I'll note, with a banged up Tua because he was hurt in that game. They shut it down in the third quarter. Tennessee didn't stop Alabama except a couple times when they stopped themselves, really, until the very end of the game. They very easily could have scored 70 points in that ball
does
game.
All of this discussion really lead us to the only way Oklahoma wins this game is if they win it like they won against West Virginia?
Maybe, but I think this is probably it's worse, honestly. The two teams that bracket Oklahoma, and this is assuming to a pretty significant extent, kind of assuming the SEC and the Big 12 are more or less equal, because while this is accounting for conference differences, we've talked about a lot on the show, the schedules are so isolated this year, there is probably more of an assumption than maybe should be that these conferences are more or less equal. The average team is within a few points of each other. Arkansas and Tennessee are the two teams that bracket Oklahoma in advanced metrics. Arkansas is 80th, Tennessee's 96th. Alabama scored 65 points against Arkansas. Again, could have scored 70. Scored 58 points against Tennessee. It's easy to say that Oklahoma needs to have a West Virginia game. They scored 59 in West Virginia. I'm going to be honest. I don't know that 59 is enough to win this game.
So there's an interesting psychological effect here that might come into play. And look, I think Alabama wins this game, but I think Alabama fans haven't explored enough reasons why they might not or why it might be close. So I think it's fair for us to explore them. So if this feels a little Oklahoma heavy, Alabama fans, that's why. You mentioned Tennessee and Arkansas, and we're going to get away from numbers for a second because we have been kind of nerd heavy to open. And I want to talk about gut for a minute. You mentioned Tennessee and Arkansas and how they performed offensively. The one thing that's not really present in those games is fear that you need 50 points to win. So that puts a different kind of pressure on your offense when you know your defense is going to give up points. It lessens mentally that margin for error to a point that you do make offensive mistakes. And we saw this against West Virginia. And this is, I think this is, again, why Alabama fans need to watch that game. West Virginia's defense is trash. So it's not going to be like that against Oklahoma. But two things. One, Oklahoma will score more points than Alabama fans, Alabama offense, Alabama defense are comfortable with seeing the other team score. Number two, West Virginia felt that pressure early. First quarter, 4th and 6, they go for it on the 6-yard line. 4th and goal from the 6, they go for it, don't get it, instead of kicking a field goal. They did that twice. They did 2 red zone opportunities where they could have kicked field goals, didn't kick field goals. They also had 2 stupid turnovers from Will Grier that led to points. So it's not really a numbers-driven thing, but are we discounting that mental factor of the kind of pressure an Oklahoma offense can put on them where an Arkansas or Tennessee couldn't, which could lead to fewer points from Alabama?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably something to that. To your point, obviously Grier didn't throw an interception, right? I mean, he fumbled the ball twice. But in terms of his passing stats, 32-49, 539 yards, 11 yards per attempt, 4 touchdowns. Those are ridiculously gaudy numbers. But at the same time, with that kind of volume of passing, they weren't able to win the game. And they felt like they needed to score more than they even did to win the game. I think sometimes when you play a team like this where there's this much pressure to score offensively, to your point, you start doing things, trying to get extra points, feeling like you're not going to get another possession, and they tend to come back to bite you because a lot of those plays are in situations where you're unlikely to be successful. I've talked about this a lot. There's this common idea among a lot of stat nerds in college football that you should go for 2 all the time, because a lot of the stats weighted for all kinds of different circumstances suggest that the odds of going for 2 versus going for 1 are such that you have a more than 50% chance of getting it if you go for 2. And so you'll go for 2, you'll more than likely make it, you'll score more points. I've always pushed back really heavily on that. And the reason for it is, in a game where things aren't quite going your way, where you're having to make an edge or you're in danger of losing, those are always the games where something doesn't go your way, where you're not quite getting your normal statistics or odds. That's the worst time to push yourself to go outside your envelope and be overly aggressive. Because when you're in those situations, those are also the situations where you're not going to get your normal output. The classic example I've always referred to is several years ago when Stanford played Oregon, and Stanford upset, a top 5 Oregon team. Chip Kelly went for 2, I think 3 times in that game, and I think they didn't get any of them, and it ended up costing them the game. They went for 4th down a couple times too. The problem was that worked for them all year. It worked great. Normally, that was the one game where the offense wasn't quite clicking for a variety of reasons, and it caused them to lose the game because they had some easy opportunities for field goals that would have let them win it in the end. West Virginia against Oklahoma, if they just kick the field goals, if they just keep on doing what they're doing, they probably win that game. But instead they press, thinking, okay, well, we're playing a team that's a bad defense. We got to score. If you're in a situation where you need those points, right? If those points really matter, which they did in that game at the end of the game, that means some stuff has happened where you're in a bad position. And you're going to want every point you can get. So in my view in a lot of these games, when you really press and you change tendency, it's doubly bad because not only are you doing something that isn't really necessarily a trend, not only are you chasing points, but I think a lot of times you're used to being successful in those circumstances. And so you have an assumption that, okay, it's reasonable to go for it on 4th and 1. When the reality, and you see this all the time, if it's 4th and 1, and a lot of times it's because they've stopped you 3 straight times running the ball on 1st and 4 and 2nd and 3rd and, 3rd and 1. And so you're not going to get on a 4th and 1 because it's a series of events that's meant that, like in West Virginia's case in this game against Oklahoma, that they were stalling in the red zone. So that in and of itself should be a red flag that you don't want to be too aggressive because you've already struggled a little bit in the red zone. You've thrown away points, and then you make poor decisions that where you feel like you're to keep your defense, keep them off the field, to keep your team in the game. You need to sort of give them sort of extra spark. You got to take points where you can get, and it almost always backfires.
From a personnel standpoint, we've heard a lot this year about how Alabama's not got a vintage Alabama defense, and I don't think that's unfair. The linebacker play to me is the biggest sort of hole there, and a lack of a huge, pass rusher. Talk a little bit about, what are the odds, or is there a possibility that this Alabama defense comes out and is just lights out? It seems like they got pissed off after the Arkansas game because, Arkansas scored 30 points. It was like 56-17 or something, and they scored 2 late ones on the backups. And then they gave up 10 against Missouri, which is probably the most comparable defense or offense to this team. Is there a possibility that Alabama comes out and gives up 17 points, 13 points, or is Oklahoma's offense so good combined with Alabama's defense not being a vintage defense being enough to where Oklahoma's going to score 30 points regardless?
Well, obviously, I think that's sort of the main question that everybody's asking about this game. How does Alabama's defense stack up in terms of how they've struggled this year at times and also in terms of their potential? We followed Alabama a lot, and we talked about early in the season what was wrong with them, why did they give up so many points, 31 points to Arkansas. The conclusion both of us made was the talent level was still there, but the assignment football was not. And when they played, particularly Arkansas, with the Chad Morris offense, they did a lot of things schematically to make Alabama flow the wrong direction, and Alabama didn't adjust well. First half against Auburn truly in that iron ball threw the kitchen sink at Alabama. It was amazing the number of formations. They had A11 on the field at one point. One of their touchdowns is a halfback pass. Just all kinds of crazy stuff, anything you could imagine. And Alabama did not play it well. And traditionally, the biggest thing with Alabama is they're consistently very good assignment-driven football. This year, they have not always been that way. I think, honestly, a little bit of his focus, perhaps, maybe lack of, I don't know if it's lack of comfort level with the defense or what's going on. The back seven's really talented, but the linebackers are not in position a lot of times. They've got 2 guys. They're not truly new starters because they played quite a bit of snaps last year when their defense was absolutely gutted at one point due to injury. But Wilson and Moses are frequently out of position. They're frequently not where they need to be. All kinds of miscues really throughout the entirety of the defense. That's really concerning to me, given how clever Lincoln Riley's offense is. And one of the things I think both of us noted watching Oklahoma, and it's the thing that gave a lot of the teams they played fits, is how often when they would bring a blitz, Oklahoma would immediately have a check. And they would toss the ball to a running back because the outside linebacker is blitzing and nobody's in position to pick him up and just get 8 easy yards. Or they would flip the ball on a crossing route. Oklahoma always has a ready counter, and they do a very good job of either, and it's hard for any of us really to know if it's ingrained in Murray and his understanding the offense, having been there a few years, and then it's partly probably checks at the line and help he's getting from the sidelines. But and a lot of it, honestly, is probably just really good play calling. They don't put themselves in a lot of bad positions, and when you blitz them, they tend to burn you. That's all kind of bad news for Alabama. The issue, on the other hand, though, is you talked about after the Arkansas game, there were periods where Alabama got challenged, especially against Missouri, we're a little cautious on this channel talking about how good Missouri's offense is because they are incredibly hot and cold with the level of the opposing defense. So there's some signs that's the issue. But Alabama just shut teams down there for the middle for a while, starting with the Missouri game. Obviously, LSU and Mississippi State. People can kind of poo-poo that all you want. But Mississippi State annihilated Kansas State offensively. Kansas State couldn't slow them down.
Ole Miss is the better one to me because it's not a transitive property in that we think Ole Miss would fare well against Oklahoma because they wouldn't. But Ole Miss beat Texas Tech 47-27. And Ole Miss objectively had the worst defense in the SEC outside of Arkansas. And they went from scoring 49 points per game out of conference, including 47 against Texas Tech, to scoring like 17 points per game inside the SEC if you don't count the Arkansas game. Same thing with Mississippi State. They scored 34. I think they beat Kansas State 34-10, shut it down late. They scored 4 points per game against the 4 ranked opponents they played inside the SEC. So I do think that there's a little bit of concern there. Talk about this for a minute, too. A lot of people are saying, well, look what happened when Alabama played Georgia. And Georgia, handled them pretty well, was scoring like crazy, kind of sputtered late. My counter to that is Georgia's offensive line, which Oklahoma has a great offensive line too, but Georgia's offensive line plus Swift and Holyfield are something that Oklahoma doesn't really have. It's a completely different type of offense. And as much as I think Trey Sermon is a good running back, he's not Rodney Anderson. Rodney Anderson is somebody who I said would, at the beginning of the year, would be, if not for splitting stats with Kyler Murray, and I said this before the season, he would win the Heisman. And he got hurt. So I don't think they have a Swift or Holyfield type running back, and they don't have that physical type of running game. So I don't think they're really analogous, but talk about that a little bit because people were kind of trashing Alabama defense after that Georgia game.
Right, and I think all of this is fair, but a lot of people probably, particularly Oklahoma fans that tune in, maybe they aren't as familiar with Georgia, maybe balk at it a little bit. So I do want to take one step back here and note, offensively, Oklahoma is an excellent team, right? And everybody knows Alabama is a good team. But the first thing you have to understand about that SEC championship game is that Georgia is the number 3 team in S&P offense. And they're the number 3 team in S&P offense in large part because they're just really darn good at running the football. And Oklahoma...
And they're efficient.
So Oklahoma is, by a significant margin, the top offense in the country statistically. But if you want to talk about overall offensive performance, Georgia, in a very tough conference, has been very successful running the ball all year. And to your point, I don't know if Georgia's offensive line is better than Oklahoma's. I am very impressed by Oklahoma's offensive line watching them all year. And we really ought to touch on that a little bit and how much that affects the offense in a minute. But I think Trey Sermon's really good. I think Brooks is a really good running back. Swift is probably he may be a first-round draft pick running back. As rare as those are, he has phenomenal speed and vision. ETN and Swift are just elite. I mean, they're going to play a lot of NFL football. Swift is very physical. He's a complete package. Now, he was hurt for the first half of the year. Even the LSU game, he was not 100%. Now, there's a whole other caveat there because we've talked about this a lot in terms of Georgia's loss to LSU, something you have to understand. Georgia abandoned the run in that game. They panicked in the second quarter. They didn't give the running backs the ball at all. I think the running backs were averaging, was it like almost 7 yards a carry in that game? And so Holyfield and Swift, you've got 2 NFL caliber tailbacks. Those guys are maybe, I don't know if they're as good as Rodney Anderson was, but they're very close to it. And Alabama, as much as Alabama didn't get throttled by the run, they still were giving up over 4 yards per carry to both those backs. It strained the offense to a large degree, and Alabama was given, once you cross 4 yards per carry, Alabama does not want you to be able to move the ball running it. So they will start loading the box and give up some in the passing game because Saban's philosophy has always been, if you can run it, we're going to lose. And he will always stop the run first, even if it compromises himself in other ways. So a lot of times you see like Swift at 4.7 yards per carry. That's even deceptive to a certain extent because that doesn't really explain. He was being more successful. Alabama had to sort of shift to keep him to 4.7 yards per carry, and it opened up other things. I don't know that Oklahoma is that dominant. The problem with Oklahoma, and this is really true, is not just we talk about all these defenses in the Big 12. I don't think anybody in the Big 12 is playing decent run defense. Not really. And no one in the Big 12 this year, early on, I think West Virginia's run defense was pretty good. And then, they kind of got injuries and then faltered later in the year. Nobody in the front seven is remotely as good as what they're going to face in Alabama. And they're not anywhere close to the plan that Georgia would have been either. And the problem here is trying to evaluate Oklahoma and where their offensive line is and their running game when they're going to play a team in Alabama that's not, if if the best defense they played statistically was Iowa State, who's not a top 25 defense, but a top 31, if they're good, if you want to set it in tiers or statistically, if you want to talk standard deviations, if they're at the good level, they're kind of close to the median but above average, well, a team that would be above them in terms of defense, that would be like, let's say, very good. That kind of team may or may not be a challenge for Oklahoma in a way that we wouldn't expect. And when I talk about them, I'm talking about, let's say, Auburn, who has a very good front seven. Alabama is a tier above that. So it's not just trying to compare them and saying they're a tier better than anyone Oklahoma's played. It's almost unique because Alabama's like 2 tiers better. And that doesn't mean Oklahoma isn't going to be able to run the ball with an incredible amount of success. It just means it's unknown. It means it's so far distantly removed from what Oklahoma's faced before that offensive line edge that I want you to talk about for a minute may or may not actually show up, and it can change the complete complexion of the game.